Hello and welcome back for another Read Aloud. We are in chapter 2 of our brand new Read Aloud book, Because of Winn-Dixie. So readers always ask themselves right at the beginning of a book a couple questions. First of all, who have we met so far? And where is the story taking place, the setting? So let's just quickly go over that and then we'll get started on chapter 2. So who have we met so far? We've met India Opal Baloney. Yep. We've also met Winn-Dixie, the dog, and the store owner. And we've heard a little bit about the preacher, but we haven't really met him yet. What do we think of Opal? What type of character is she? She's pretty brave, right? Here's some evidence. She goes into a store as a little kid, and while all of these adults are running around freaking out about this dog, she just speaks up and says, "Hey, that's my dog." That's pretty brave. It's also pretty kind-hearted, right? Very good-hearted of her to want to save the dog from having to go to the pound. So she's brave, she's good-hearted, she's kind and caring. Now, we don't really know where the story takes place yet besides the supermarket, but we don't know where that is. I think we'll learn that in chapter 2. So we're still wondering, too, will the preacher want to have a dog? That's what Opal is wondering. She's about to bring Winn-Dixie over to her house to see if they can keep Winn-Dixie. We have to find out what the preacher will say. Chapter 2. I'm also reading this online still because I don't have my book yet. Chapter 2. That summer I found Winn-Dixie was also the summer me and the preacher moved to Naomi, Florida, so he could be the preacher at the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. My daddy is a good preacher and a nice man, but sometimes it's hard for me to think about him as my daddy because he spends so much time preaching or thinking about preaching or getting ready to preach. And so, in my mind, I think of him as the preacher. Before I was born, he was a missionary in India, and that is how I got my first name. A missionary is a person that goes to another country to try to get other people to join their church. But he calls me by my second name, Opal, because that was his mother's name, and he loved her a lot. So that's kind of where we learn that she gets her name from. Her dad was a missionary in India. That's her first name. And Opal, that was her mother's name. And he loved her a lot. Anyway, while me and Winn-Dixie walked home, I told him how I got my name, and I told him how I had just moved to Naomi. I also told him about the preacher and how he was a good man, even if he was too distracted with sermons and prayers and suffering people to go grocery shopping. But you know what? I told Winn-Dixie, you are a suffering dog, so maybe he will take to you right away. Maybe he'll let me keep you. Winn-Dixie looked up at me and wagged his tail. He was kind of limping, like something was wrong with one of his legs. And I have to admit, he stunk bad. He was an ugly dog, but already I loved him with all of my heart. There's some more evidence to show that she's good-hearted. She doesn't care that Winn-Dixie stinks and that he's kind of an ugly dog. She already loves him with all her heart. When we got to the Friendly Corners trailer park, I told Winn-Dixie that he had to behave right and be quiet because this was an all-adult trailer park, and the only reason I got to live in it was because the preacher was a preacher and I was a good, quiet kid. I got to live in it. I was what the Friendly Corners trailer park manager, Mr. Alfred, called an exception to the rule. And I told Winn-Dixie he had to act like an exception too. Specifically, I told him not to pick any fights with Mr. Alfred's cats or Mrs. Detweiler's little yappy Yorkie dog, Samuel. Winn-Dixie looked up at me while I was telling him everything, and I swear he understood what I was saying. Sit, I told him when we got back to the trailer. He sat right down. He had good manners. Stay here, I told him. I'll be right back. So Winn-Dixie's a pretty smart dog. And Opal kind of thinks that he understands her. Like when she was speaking to him about her life, she felt like he was really listening. Kind of sounds like Opal needs a friend, doesn't it? The preacher was sitting in the living room, working at the little fold-out table. He had papers spread all around him, and he was rubbing his nose, which always means he is thinking hard. Daddy, I said. He said back. Daddy, do you know how you always tell me that we should help those that are less fortunate than ourselves? He said, rubbing his nose and looked around at his papers. Well, I said, I found a less fortunate at the grocery store. Is that right? He said. Yes, sir, I told him. I stared at the preacher really hard. Sometimes he reminded me of a turtle hiding inside its shell, in there thinking about things and not ever sticking his head out into the world. Daddy, I was wondering, could this less fortunate, could he stay with us for a while? Finally, the preacher looked up at me. Opal, he said, what are you talking about? I found a dog, I told him, and I want to keep him. No dogs, the preacher said. We've talked about this before. You don't need a dog. I know, I said. I know I don't need a dog, but this dog needs me. Look, I said. I went to the trailer door and I hollered, Winn-Dixie! Winn-Dixie's ears shot straight up in the air and he grinned and sneezed. And then he came limping up the steps and into the trailer and put his head right in the preacher's lap, right on top of a pile of papers. The preacher looked at Winn-Dixie. He looked at his ribs and his matted up fur and the places where he was bald. The preacher's nose wrinkled up. Like I said, the dog smelled pretty bad. Winn-Dixie looked up at the preacher. He pulled back his lips and showed the preacher all of his crooked yellow teeth and wagged his tail and knocked some of the preacher's papers off the table. Then he sneezed and the papers fluttered to the floor. What did you call this dog? The preacher asked. Winn-Dixie, I whispered. I was afraid to say anything too loud. I could see that Winn-Dixie was having a good effect on the preacher. He was making him poke his head out of his shell. Well, said the preacher, if he's a stray if I've ever seen one. He put down his pencil and scratched Winn-Dixie behind his ears. And a less fortunate, too, that's for sure. Are you looking for a home? The preacher asked, real soft, to Winn-Dixie. Winn-Dixie wagged his tail. Well, the preacher said, I guess you found one. So the preacher said yes. Is that what you thought was going to happen? I kind of thought he was going to say no way. Why did the preacher say yes? It's kind of Winn-Dixie. Winn-Dixie kind of has this effect on him. Opal says that her daddy is kind of like a turtle in its shell. He kind of stays very to himself, stays inside his shell. But when Dixie came along, she says Winn-Dixie was making him poke his head out of his shell. So kind of like show his personality a little bit more. He kind of keeps to himself. Winn-Dixie's kind of making him come out and be himself. So that's a good thing for Opal and for Winn-Dixie because it means that Winn-Dixie gets to stay. But as we kind of learned, they live in a trailer park that's only for adults, and Opal only gets to live there because her dad's the preacher. Mr. Alfred, who owns the trailer park, probably doesn't allow dogs there. We know Mr. Alfred has cats, but there's probably no dogs allowed. So I wonder how long this is going to last for. Will they have to keep Winn-Dixie a secret? We'll find out in chapter 3. I'll see you guys next time.